Mr. President, back in May, Congress passed and the President signed legislation guaranteeing Congress the chance to take an up or down vote on any nuclear deal with Iran. That was widely debated here in the Senate and in the House of Representatives. Votes were held, and in the United States Senate, 98 senators, both sides of the aisle, agreed that we should pass legislation requiring Congress have a voice, and through Congress, the American people have a voice, in something that is so important to America's national security interests. And yet here we are, 4 months later, and the same Democrats who voted for that at the time, who joined Republicans, 98 United States senators voted for the American people to have their voice heard on this. These same Democrats are now chosen to stifle the voices of the American people by refusing to allow an up and down vote on the President's nuclear agreement. Twice now, when we attempted to move to a final vote on the deal, only 4 Democrats broke ranks with their colleagues and stood up to the President. Well, that's a deeply disappointing result, Mr. President, especially given the stakes on this agreement. And I would have to say that in some ways, I suppose, if you're trying to protect your President from having to make a decision about whether or not to sign or veto this legislation, that maybe they were pushed into that position by the administration. But the fact of the matter is, Mr. President, that this is something that was voted on here in the United States Senate and the House of Representatives, overwhelmingly supported, sent to the President. The President of the United States reluctantly signed it into law, but the understanding was from that point forward that when this actually was brought to the floor of the United States Senate, that there would be an open debate and that there would be a vote. And all that's, I think, simply expected by the American people is an opportunity to be heard from in the form of an up and down vote through their representatives here in the United States Senate. Well, I would think that even if Democrats here in the Senate object to or to the vote that we would have on a resolution of disapproval and want to support the President's position, that they would allow it to be voted on, let it go to the President. If the President's so proud of this deal, and clearly he is, why would he not then want the opportunity to veto a resolution of disapproval coming from the Congress on this? Well, I think clearly Democrats here in the Senate are doing their best to try and protect the President from having to make that decision, notwithstanding the President's assertions that this is a wonderful deal for our country, a wonderful deal for our allies. Of course, the facts tell an entirely different story. Mr. President, a nuclear-armed Iran is a direct threat to the security of the United States and our allies in the Middle East, and the American people deserved that chance to have their voices heard. Now, I want to take just a moment, Mr. President, to read some of the statements that have been made by Iran's supreme leader over the past few weeks. This is directly from the Twitter feed of the Ayatollah Khomeini. Speaking to Israel, he says, and I quote, "You will not see the next 25 years," end quote. That's the supreme leader of Iran speaking to Israel. And then he goes on to add, "God willing, there will be nothing of the Zionist regime in 25 years. Again, coming directly from the Twitter feed of the Iranian supreme leader. Of the United States, he says something that he's said before, and I quote, "U.S. is the great Satan," end quote. It's exactly, as I said, Mr. President, coming directly from the supreme leader, from the Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran. So I would challenge my colleagues here in the United States Senate to reflect on those statements. Think about it. Not only do they illustrate Iran's hostility toward the United States and Israel, but they demonstrate another key point when it comes to this agreement, and that is Iran is playing the long game. President Obama and Secretary Kerry may be thinking in terms of the next few months, maybe thinking about their own legacy, but the Iranian regime is thinking in terms of years and decades. Now, while this deal may slow Iran down in the near term, in the long term, it legitimizes Iran's nuclear enrichment program and drastically shortens its breakout period for a bomb. Under this agreement, in 10 years, Iran will have transitioned from its current IR-1 centrifuges, which is about, some they say, 1960s technology, the large-scale production of IR-2M centrifuges, which are 4 or 5 times faster than what Iran has today. In addition, this deal gives Iran the option of building still more advanced IR-6 and IR-8 centrifuges down the road, which are 15 times faster at enriching uranium. In other words, without once violating this agreement, in a decade, Iran will have reduced its breakout period for a bomb from a few months to a few weeks. This agreement also allows Iran to keep its fortified nuclear facilities, and it gives Iran access to conventional weapons and ballistic missiles capable of delivering a warhead far beyond Iran's borders. Plus, under this agreement, Iran will have full access to international markets and the materials and technical components it needs to build a bomb, material that right now it can only access through black market channels. Mr. President, Iran's playing the long game. And in the long term, this is a very good deal for Iran. And let's be clear about Iran's intentions regarding its nuclear program. Iran is not simply interested in pursuing a nuclear enrichment program for its civilian energy needs. Iran is interested in building a bomb. Make no mistake about it. If Iran were only interested in producing electricity, it wouldn't need a nuclear enrichment program. Just look at other countries that use nuclear power to produce electricity. Sweden, for example, currently has 10 functioning nuclear power plants, but it does not have a domestic nuclear enrichment program. Finland has 4 nuclear power plants, but it does not conduct its own nuclear enrichment. Ukraine, which voluntarily gave up its post-Soviet nuclear arsenal in the 1990s, has 15 nuclear power plants, and it does not conduct its own nuclear enrichment. Mexico, Bulgaria, the Czech Republic, Spain, Switzerland, South Africa, all these countries have nuclear power plants, but none of these countries conducts its own nuclear enrichment. And none of these countries needs to conduct its own enrichment because the fuel they need can be easily obtained in the world market where there is actually a surplus of enriched uranium. No one worries that these countries are on the verge of building a bomb because their intentions are clear. They're only interested in the electricity they can obtain from nuclear power, and for this, they don't need to enrich their own uranium. Another striking example can be seen on the Korean Peninsula. South Korea, a thriving democracy, has 23 operating nuclear power plants, yet it does not have a commercial enrichment program or even a spent fuel reprocessing facility. North Korea, on the other hand, chose to pursue an undisclosed illicit nuclear enrichment program, and North Korea has produced a nuclear bomb. Well, Mr. President, based on Iran's behavior, is Iran trying to be more like South Korea with its multitude of nuclear power plants and no enrichment capabilities, or North Korea, which fails to provide its population with electricity but still built a nuclear bomb? If Iran really wants a peaceful, civilian nuclear energy program, it does not need to be enriching uranium. Plain and simple. The only reason Iran needs a nuclear enrichment program is if it is interested in developing a nuclear weapon. If Iran really wanted to silence all its critics, if it really wanted to prove that it's operating in good faith, it could dismantle its nuclear enrichment facility at Fordo and halt its domestic enrichment program altogether. And if President Obama had reached a deal that accomplished this, the Senate would not have sought a vote on a resolution of disapproval. Instead, Republicans and Democrats alike would have been supporting the agreement and praising the success of the negotiations. But that's not what happened. Instead, the President agreed to a deal that validates Iran's enrichment program, allows it to maintain its nuclear facilities, and explicitly permits Iran to continue researching and manufacturing advanced centrifuges. In other words, in a few short years, this deal gives Iran everything it would need for the speedy development of a nuclear weapon. If Iran genuinely wants a peaceful nuclear energy program, it can put everyone's concerns to rest and dismantle its enrichment infrastructure. Short of that, Iran is telegraphing to the world that it wants a nuclear bomb. Well, Mr. President, I want to shift gears for just a moment and address an assertion that Secretary Kerry has made numerous times throughout this debate. As we all know, one of the major points of contention surrounding this deal is the side agreements between Iran and the International Atomic Energy Agency, or the IAEA, that remain a secret. The nuclear deal grants inspections at Iran's known nuclear sites, but the details of these inspections are being kept secret between the IAEA and Iran. Secretary Kerry has asserted that keeping these side agreements secret is standard practice for the IAEA, but is that really the case? Are private agreements between Iran and host countries the norm? Well, I wanted to find out. So last week I sat down with the former deputy director of the IAEA, Ali Heinonen, and discussed the policies and procedures of the IAEA with him at length. Mr. Heinonen is an expert on this topic, having served with the IAEA for 27 years and personally inspected, I might add, sites in Iran in the past, and he was able to tell me that keeping side agreements a secret is not standard for the IAEA. It is an exception that has periodically been used to protect proprietary information for commercial reasons. Now, let me just repeat that, Mr. President. In contrast to what Secretary Kerry is claiming, refusing to disclose these side agreements is not the IAEA's normal procedure. It is an exception. When commercially sensitive information is not at risk, the IAEA's practice is to make the details of agreements public. So then why is the IAEA keeping its side agreements with Iran a secret? So far as we know, no proprietary concerns exist, which leads to the inevitable conclusion that these agreements have been kept a secret because they outline a weak inspections regime that would be unlikely to stand up to scrutiny. And the limited information that has been leaked so far backs up this conclusion. According to leaked documents made available to the Associated Press, the side agreements with the IAEA allow Iran to collect its own samples with cameras recording the process. Iran will then deliver these samples to the IAEA to be tested for radioactive material. If that's true, Mr. President, there is reason to be deeply concerned, because a process like that would give Iran the opportunity to hide its nuclear activities from the IAEA. It's like having the fox guard the hen house. One of the agreements made by Secretary Kerry when the discussion of a 24-day waiting period for inspections of undisclosed sites came up was that traces of radioactive material could not be hidden in 24 days. That was the Secretary's argument. Samples taken from surfaces where activities involving radioactive materials have taken place will still have radioactive traces after the materials themselves are taken away. That's been the argument that's been made by Secretary Kerry. And the Secretary is right about that, Mr. President. Traces of radioactive material do remain, but what the Secretary doesn't mention is that those traces can be hidden. If tabletops, floors, or walls are painted over with certain materials, not just once, but several times, samples taken from their surfaces will not reveal radioactive material. And that makes allowing Iran to take its own samples very dangerous, even if cameras are present. If inspections are intrusive enough, meaning actual human IAEA inspectors are walking through a facility looking not only for illicit activity, but for signs of someone trying to cover up such activity, it's pretty easy to identify newly painted surfaces and to know that something is amiss. That's the difference between actual inspections by the IAEA and having Iran collect samples and having cameras cover it. If, as reports suggest, the IAEA has agreed to allow monitoring by camera instead of sending inspectors into facilities, it will be very difficult for the IAEA to pick up on efforts to hide illicit activities such as repainted surfaces. And if the IAEA's secret side deals allow Iran to conduct its own inspections, then it's no wonder Iran wants to keep such deals a secret. And Mr. President, given the possibility that these secret side deals significantly weaken the inspections regime authorized by this agreement, it's imperative that the contents of these deals be made public. In addition, if these agreements are not made known, the IAEA will be setting a dangerous precedent that could undermine its credibility moving forward. If Iran gets off the hook on inspections and the IAEA allows this, what happens next time there's a rogue regime pursuing an illicit nuclear program? Well, I'll tell you what's going to happen. That nation will ask for the same inspections deal that Iran got. If the White House is serious on any level about preventing future nuclear proliferation, it needs to consider very carefully what it is doing right now. Because right now, the White House is establishing a precedent that if a country is belligerent enough and hostile enough and pursues a nuclear program in violation of international agreements, eventually the international community will validate that country's nuclear program and possibly even allow the country to conduct its own inspections. Mr. President, that is an incredibly dangerous precedent to set. Mr. President, I understand that senators have different ideological foundations from which we form our views, and that sometimes political pressures come into play when senators are looking at legislation. But it is very unfortunate that so many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle chose to ignore the text of this agreement and cast their vote on ideological grounds. The truth is that this agreement will provide a hostile nation with an expressed hatred of the United States and Israel with a clear path to a nuclear bomb, and I am deeply disappointed that Senate Democrats could not even allow a vote on a deal of this magnitude, a deal that will shape the situation in the Middle East for years to come. As we move forward, Republicans are going to do everything we can to protect our country and our allies from the worst consequences of this agreement, starting with Leader McConnell's amendment to require a show of good faith from Tehran before congressional sanctions are lifted. I hope, Mr. President, that Democrats will join us. They still have that chance. I really do hope that they will. This is that important. It's important to America's national security's interest. It's important to our allies in that region of the world. This agreement is a bad agreement. It needs to be rejected. And at a minimum, it needs to at least be voted on by the people's elected representatives of this country. Something that 98 senators agreed to do just 4 months ago. And now all of a sudden, because the president evidently doesn't want to have to deal with the decision about whether or not to veto this resolution of disapproval, Democrats have dug in here in the United States Senate and are preventing the very thing that 98 of us as senators voted to allow to happen just 4 months ago. That is wrong. The American people deserve better. Mr. President, I yield the floor.